Hello, Shalom, this is Rabbi Johnny Solomon, the virtual rabbi. Welcome to my online Chumash Rashi shiur dedicated in memory to my dear friend Yudalei ben Shmuel Leonard Borgia, whose Shloshim it is in fact today. We're going to be learning some psukim, Rashis and other wonderful mafarshim on Parshat Bo. I hope you enjoy. We begin with Shemot Perek Yud Psukim Aleph to Bet. V'yomar Hashem el Moshe bo el Paro, כי אני הכבדתי את ליבו ואת לב עבדיו. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, go to Pharaoh, because I've hardened Pharaoh's heart and that of his officials, למען שתהי אותותי אלה בקרבו, so that I may place my signs in his midst. And then Pasuk Bet says something quite curious. ולמען תספר באוזני בנך ובן בנך את אשר התעללתי במצרים, ואת אותותי אשר שמתי בם, וידעתם כי אני השם. What does God tell Moshe Rabbeinu to do? Tell the ears of your children and your grandchildren how I made the Egyptians a laughing stock by the signs that I've placed among them, and you will know that I am the Lord. What's the meaning of making the Egyptians into a laughing stock? And in particular, what's it got to do with this upcoming plague of Arbeh? ויהפוך השם רוח ים חזק מאוד, ויישא את הארבה, ויתקעהו ים הסוף, לא נשאר הרבה אחד בכל גבול מצרים. By the end of the plague of locusts, what are we told? The Lord reversed a very strong west wind, and it picked up the locusts and swept them into the sea of reeds. Not one locust remained within all the borders of Egypt. On which Rashi then says the following, Lo nisha'ar be'echad, af hamluchim shemalchu mehem. Even the salted ones, which the Egyptians had salted for themselves to eat. What I'd like to do is explain the connection between the concept of hitalalti, as well as this Rashi referring to how the Egyptians salted their locusts. And to do so, let's move to the Sefer Kol Dodi that I recently discovered of Rav David Halevi Frand of London, a community leader. And here he says something of interest. למען תספר את אשר התעללתי במצרים. And he says, יש לעיין למה דווקא לגבי מכת הרבה מצינו דנקת הקדוש ברוך הוא לשון התעללתי. Why specifically in relation to the plague of locusts do we find this idea of HaKadosh Baruch Hu making the Egyptians into a laughing stock, or maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu shining a light on the way the Egyptians made themselves into a laughing stock? And he says, it's because I think the plague of locusts differed from all the other plagues. Because locusts, at least on face value, have a benefit, have a blessing. Why? Because they are able to be consumed. They're edible. Compared to all the other plagues, which were evidently a punishment from the moment they were encountered by the Mitzrim, the locusts on first glance seem to be some kind of blessing. Goodness grief, we've got a whole abundance of edible locusts. And as a result of this, we can understand how either HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a laughing stock of the Mitzrim, or really they made themselves into a laughing stock. They initially thought the locusts had come as a form of blessing, because the locusts which were edible had come upon them. They thought, wow, we've been given a bonus. Until they realized this in fact was a curse. And this helps us understand Rashi's comment that we studied on Pasuk Yutet. That there were no locusts left, even those that had been salted and put in some kind of brine. That is, the Mitzvah had thought that the locusts had come as a blessing, as a gift of food, and they took them and they stored them, and it became quite clear that they'd entirely misread what was taking place. they made themselves into a laughing stock. And thus even those that they'd taken in storage for their own consumption was removed. Ad kan, our first insight. Let's now move on to our next insight, based on Shmot Perek Yud Pasuk Chafbet. V'yet Moshe et yado al hashamayim v'hi choshech hafela b'chol eret Mitzrayim shloshet yamim. Moshe stretches out his arm, and there was thick darkness over the entire land of Egypt for 3 days. On this, Rashi says the following. Though the Pasuk refers to 3 days, in fact, there were 2 sets of 3 days. The first set was 3 days, Choshech shel ofel shelo ra'u ish et achiv, 3 days where one couldn't see one another, and another 3 days of the impossibility of movement, shelo kamu ish mitachtav, the person wasn't even able to get up from wherever they were sitting. Yoshev en yachol lamod, somebody who was sitting wasn't able to rise. Omed en yachol leshev, and somebody who was standing wasn't able to sit. Now, Rashi then goes on and says, and why did they have choshech? He gives 2 reasons. Number 1, relating to Bnei Israel, who weren't interested in leaving Mitzrayim, and in the plague of darkness, this is when those people died. Secondly, it provided the opportunity for Bnei Israel to take the kelim, the vessels, the utensils of the Egyptians. In fact, numerous commentaries explain that the first 3 days correspond to the first reason, and the second 3 days correspond to the second reason. This is evident from Rashi, who instead of saying davar acher, says the word va'od. But on this point, Dr. Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, in her wonderful book, The Particulars of Rapture, says something very, very deep. Rashi cites a midrash that has a plague of darkness enduring for 2 3-day periods. In the first, the Egyptians merely could not see one another. In the second, there was absolute darkness, of absolute immobility. Those who sat could not stand, those who stood could not sit. And she goes on to explain, this is a depiction of a dehumanized rigidity, a hardness that mimics the rigidity of Pharaoh's heart throughout the narrative. There is a horror, even a moral repulsiveness in such a condition. One can detect in Rashi's account of this darkness a similar sense of bafflement, because Rashi asks here, unlike all the other Makot, why did he bring darkness upon them? The very question is unusual. On no other of the plagues does he ask such a question. Yet there is something about the plague of darkness, about the way it reduces a human being to a blind and paralyzed vulnerability, that defies rational or moral explanation. And indeed, continues Dr. Zornberg, Rashi's answers to his own question withdraw a narrative interest from the Egyptians to Israelites. As mentioned, we focus the attention on the Bnei Israel who weren't interested in leaving Mitzrayim and them taking the kelim. In this kind of darkness, one might say repentance, tshuva, becomes impossible. There is no possible response to the terror of such a condition. So I love this explanation that how choshech was mimicking, was paralleling that inability to make decisions and move that we see and we read about in terms of the heart of Pharaoh. Let's move on to our next pasuk. HaChodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodashim. We have in Shemot Perek Yud Bet Pasuk Bet the commandment, the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. This month shall be to you the head of the months. Rishon hu lachem lechodshei Hashanah. Will be the first for the rest of the year. That is, at that point we weren't given names of months, so Nisan was a first, and Iyar was a second, etc., etc. Yet Rashi says that Moshe found the concept of Rosh Chodesh difficult. Nitkashe Moshe amolal alvana be'ezu shir tir'es et yeruya lekadesh. He didn't understand the moment of the moon, at which point we're supposed to sanctify the new moon. In fact, the word hazeh here indicates HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as Rashi says here, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to point to him that this is the form of the moon that it needs to be when sanctifying the new month. Why is it so hard, though, to understand the concept of Rosh Chodesh, to understand how that slither of the moon indicates a new month? On this, Rav Moshe Feinstein says something magnificent. Here in Kol Ram he says the following. וכתב רש"י, הראו לבנה בחידושה ואמר לו, כשהירח מתחדש יהיה לך ראש חודש. When the moon renews, it will be Rosh Chodesh. And also it's important to note that this was said in relation to the month of Nisan. What's a connection, asked Rav Moshe Feinstein, between the inability of Moshe Rabbeinu to understand the transition and the shape of the moon in terms of sanctifying the moon when it's just a slither, and the fact it refers to Chodesh Nisan? And let me explain it outside of the text, but he says it so beautifully here too. He says, it's important to note that there are two Rosh Hashanahs in many ways in the year. One is Rosh Hashanah of humanity, and one is Rosh Hashanah for the Jewish people. Rosh Hashanah for humanity is Tishrei. It's when we have Rosh Hashanah. And what does that commemorate? The birth of Ha'adam, the human being, who, it's important to note, was born not as a baby, but instead as a fully fledged adult. On Tishrei, we focus on the individual who's born as a fully fledged adult. Of course, from then on, all other human beings were born naturally and were babies. What is Nisan? It's Rosh Hashanah for the Jewish people. Okay? And it's why we count as a Jewish people Nisan as the first month of the year. So ask Rav Moshe Feinstein, why was it so hard for Moshe to understand Rosh Chodesh? Well, it's because HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe, lead the Jewish people. Moshe said, I don't understand. I'm looking for like a fully formulated Jewish people. I'm looking for a Tishrei, a Ha'adam Jewish people. I'm looking for a full moon looking like Jewish people. One which is already constructed, one which is fully formulated, one which has clarity and direction. And the Kadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, that's not your task. Your task is to take this thin slither of a Jewish people and grow them. And as you grow them, you'll realize their potential. What he's saying here is the difficulty of Moshe Rabbeinu is making sense of the Jewish people as they stood there, just as much as it's hard to understand that when you see a slither of the moon, that it will soon reveal itself to be an entire moon. And through this, Hashem was teaching Moshe an important lesson about leadership, which is all about helping people find their potential, helping individuals realize who they innately can become. We are not like Ha'adam, born fully fledged with everything. We are born as small babies which require growing, which require grafting, which require grit. And this is what Moshe Rabbeinu had to do as a leader of Am Yisrael, as represented by HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. Look at that thin slice. You need to acknowledge that, you need to celebrate that, and you need to help it grow. Ad Kan, Rav Moshe Feinstein in Kol Ram, which you have here, really a beautiful explanation. We now move on to what Am Yisrael are then called upon to do, to slaughter the Korban Pesach and to put the blood around their doors. But where are they supposed to put it around the doors? If you trust the images often found in children's books, it's on the outside of the door. And there is a dea, an opinion in Chazal that says that's where the blood was put. But in fact, the majority of opinions, and that is what is reflected in Rashi, tell us different. V'yadam lachem le'ot ala batim asher atem sham v'reitem et adam v'fasachti alechem v'rabechem megef l'mashchit ba'akoti be'eretz Mitzrayim. V'yadam lachem le'ot, right, this blood will be for you as a sign. Lachem le'ot v'lo la'acherim. It's meant to be a sign for you, not for others. As a result of that, mikan shelo natnu adam ela mibifnim. Rashi emphasizes the opinion that says that the blood was daubed on the inside of the door, on the inside of the house, not on the outside. But why? Why is the blood on the inside, not on the outside? Well, this is something I wrote some while ago, an insider's view of Jewish continuity. What I wish to emphasize here is that where do we grow as Jews the most? Is it outside of the home or inside? it's inside. Embedded in this interpretation is a deep message about how to achieve Jewish continuity. While the Egyptians worshipped lambs and lived according to values different to those of the Israelites, our ancestors were told to make signs inside their homes as a way of showing them that the best practice to maintain our identity is not through public acts that oppose alien cultures, although that's necessary, but through personal commitments that affirm our connection with our own heritage. From here we learn that the place where Jewish continuity is forged is a Jewish home. And this is why the Jewish home is a true center of Jewish life. Our homes must contain clear signs of Jewish pride and palpably reflect Jewish values. And when we enter our homes, we should know that it is here where the Jewish future is born. This is an important idea. All too often we talk about how we appear as Jews on the outside, which certainly is important. It's essential that we live as Jews inside our home, right? Making sure that Torah is part of our home and Jewish values are part of our conversations. Let's move on to our final pasuk. What did Am Yisrael do with the dough? With the dough as they're leaving Mitzrayim, Yisa'am et betzeko tem yechmat misarotam tzurot b'simlotam al shichmam. They carry it on their shoulders. Al shichmam afal pish behemot harbe holichu mahem mechavavim hayu et mitzvah. Even though they had animals going alongside them, they were loyal, they were in love with this mitzvah, and so they carried what was to become the matzah on their shoulders. And on this, Rabbi Yitzchak Twersky draws a distinction between Hiddur mitzvah and Chivuv mitzvah. Hiddur mitzvah is how we focus on the object of a mitzvah, how we make it nice. We have a nice mezuzah case out of Chivuv mitzvah. Out of Hiddur mitzvah. What is Chivuv mitzvah? It is where we ourselves, through our actions, show our love for mitzvahs. Hiddur mitzvah is about an object, the chefta. Chivuv mitzvah is about the gava, the person. And we see both in Parashat Bo and B'Shalach, with Bo in terms of the matzah, and B'Shalach in terms of the Atzmot Yosef, the bones of Yosef. A chivuv mitzvah, a love of mitzvahs. And that's something we really must show, I would say in particular, inside our homes, as I mentioned previously, in terms of that Rashi. Hiddur mitzvah, having nice things, is wonderful. Chivuv mitzvah, showing that you are in love with mitzvahs, that's extraordinary. And we see it as part of our redemptive process. So what we've done here is gone through a number of psukim. We've mentioned how Kadosh Baruch Hu made a laughing stock of the Egyptians, or they made a laughing stock of themselves. We mentioned how there were days of darkness and how that darkness reflects what was going on in the heart of Paro and all his officers. We mentioned Rosh Chodesh and how Moshe was tasked with the duty of growing the Jewish people, just like the moon seems to grow. We talked about how Jewish values are born primarily inside of the home, and that's why the blood was inside the home. And we talked about the difference between Hiddur mitzvah and Chivuv mitzvah, how it's important to have nice objects, but really more important is to show our love of our Jewish identity, of mitzvahs, and of Torah itself. Wishing you all Shabbat Shalom.